So thanks, Riel, for taking the time to talk with me today. This video, just a briefing for the viewers, comes as a follow-up of the first video I have uploaded on my channel, and that video was about the different terms that we use to refer to the discipline of futures and foresight. And in that video, I said something about futures literacy that Riel was not completely agree with. So I asked Riel to have a debate with me on this, and I'm glad that you accepted. So in this video, I would like to have a debate with you, Riel, and I would like to accomplish two things. The first thing is possibly to rectify what I've said about futures literacy if we will find this is not completely correct during our chat. And secondly, I would like to have the opportunity to challenge your viewpoint on some aspect of futures literacy that I think they're not completely clear, and with the ultimate objective of making some clarity around all of these terms that we have to refer to futures and foresight. So if you are okay, I would start asking you some questions.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, glad to be able to discuss with you. And let me just say, by way of introduction, clarity is, of course, a good thing. Clarity that's precipitous, or clarity that doesn't reflect the negotiated nature of meaning and context, is perhaps not always that helpful. So let me just say, by way of preface, that I understand the use of the term debate, but I'm not so sure that that's what's going on here. From my point of view, in any case, this is really a question of attempting to understand, and there is certainly clarification involved, but the question of right and wrong, correct or incorrect, might be perhaps not the best way to frame the discussion. This is an emerging issue, as always, how people see and understand key concepts and the way in which theories and theoretical frameworks evolve. So I take it more in that spirit.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, I don't aim to find the right and wrong, but yeah, I do know that there are so many terms that we use, and so I believe that after our chat, I at least hope to have learned more about how to position the name futures literacy, what it means, and how to use it, and hopefully other people will have learned more too. Right?
That's the idea.
So first question, let's start from the very basic. What is futures literacy? Like a very basic definition to a layman, to somebody who never heard about futures literacy before.
The easiest entry point, taking a layman's perspective, so not talking about the history of these concepts or the technical aspects, is to simply say that everybody, all the time, uses the future. You use the future when you go to the cinema with friends. You use the future when you buy food for dinner. You use the future when you decide to take a course of study in order to gain a degree, thinking that that will be useful in the future. You actually use money because you think that tomorrow it will be able to purchase something. In other words, it will have value. So we use the future in a very fundamental, practical, everyday way, even to cross the street, because you calculate the trajectory of the oncoming cars and you say, in the future, they will be intersecting with this path, and therefore I won't cross the street and I'll wait until they're gone. So the future is something that we use continuously. And so it's from the point of view of everyday people, it's saying, hey, are you aware that you use the future all the time? And are you aware that you use the future on the basis of a whole set of assumptions and frameworks and myths and narrative structures? Oh, you're not so aware of that. You're not so familiar with that. Well, let's think about it. Let's look into the different ways in which you use the future. And that's not dissimilar. So here I'll talk about the word literacy. It's not that dissimilar from saying to somebody, hey, you don't know how to read and write? You don't understand the alphabet? Oh, well, you can learn the alphabet. You can learn to read and write, and you can become acquainted with that whole way of looking at and understanding the world. So futures literacy is about the future, the way humans use the future, and it's about understanding how and why you think about the future. That's the basics.
Right. I read your book, Transforming the Future, and I think I have a basic understanding of the concept of futures literacy. And correct me if I'm wrong, it's also about bringing explicit awareness of the future, right? I'm trying to rephrase what you just said. Explicit awareness when it's usually implicit, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing is, as I've just said, people use the future all the time. They just don't think about it very much. So that's exactly what you just said. It's tacit. It's not explicit. There's a famous line from Molière where Monsieur Jourdain discovers, my goodness, you mean I've been speaking prose all my life? Yes, of course you've been speaking prose all your life, because that's what prose is. It's how you speak.
Absolutely. And it's about using the future in the present, at least thinking about the future in the present, right?
Well, it's like any competency. Competencies are applied. Capabilities are applied.
Right.
Those are things you do. I'm able to, make pasta. I'm able to drive a car. So I'm able to read and write. It's a competency. So futures literacy is a competency which is applied and used, but it's hugely diverse. In other words, humans use the future in many different ways for many, many different reasons. And when you begin to unpack what this is all about, in the same way that you begin to unpack reading and writing, you begin to realize, hey, where did human language come from? How's that related to our brains and cognition? You dive into all sorts of things. In the same way, when you begin to unpack what it means to use the future, to use our imaginations, to think about the future, because the future can only be imagined, what you begin to realize is that there are underlying anticipatory systems. And lo and behold, even trees, cats, and single-celled organisms have anticipatory systems, which means that the whole structure of the way humans use the future, in other words, how we use our imaginations, is grounded in something very fundamental and biological, and based on our universe, which happens to be a time-space, creative, non-deterministic universe. So given that anticipation is a fundamental attribute of biology, this is work from Robert Rosen, and given that we live in a time-space, creative, emergent universe, you put the two of those together and wow, you've got lots and lots of different ways and reasons for thinking about the future. That's future studies. Future studies encompasses the study of all those things that are relevant to the way humans use the future.
Got it. So moving on, futures literacy, correct me if I'm wrong, it is quite different from all of those practices that we do in Foresight. At least I'm thinking about the activities that we do in organizations and communities when we try to identify the driving forces to create scenarios at multiple level, individual, organizational level, national level. To facilitating a group of individuals, testing the strategy of an organization against the scenarios, and mobilizing some actions. I'm thinking that those capabilities are developed over time with the practice of foresight, right? And usually at the beginning, what we do is, yes, we start to be more familiar with the futures to bring it at an explicit level when it was not explicit before. But that, to my understanding, comes before the development of a more expertise-driven sort of skill set. So this brings me to our major point of contention, which was whether futures literacy is something that we teach at early pedagogical stages or all the time. Isn't that because futures literacy appears to be coming before those foresight skills? Isn't futures literacy something we teach at the very beginning, a more basic capability compared to the skill set of futures and foresight? This is my question to you.
Yeah, Alex, I mean, I think we need to break the pieces down. Okay. Now, teaching is one topic. It's an important topic. When people learn things is an important topic. But analytically, I think it's not very complicated here to say when people learn to read and write, they end up starting, writing things, and we have literature, let's say, for instance, or we have the Constitution, or we have a law, or we have a grocery list. Okay, and you can distinguish. You've learned to read and write. You can use what you know how to do, read and write, for good things, for bad things, for beautiful things, for horrible things. In other words, it has a huge diversity. Futures literacy is a capability based on anticipatory systems and processes. It can be applied to rocket science, econometrics. It can be applied to climate science from the point of view of modeling. It can be based on scenarios from Hollywood's point of view, Blade Runner and Black Mirror, or it can be based on the back of the envelope scenario that we're seeing all the time when people talk about COVID-19 these days. In other words, I'm a bit unsure why you want to make these distinctions that seem to me to be analytically rather curious, because we simply have continuums here, and you have continuums where there's more in depth. It's like we have departments of literature, we have departments of semiotics, we have the study of modeling, we have the study of storytelling and narratives. We have speculative fiction. We have divination and spiritual ways of thinking about the future. In other words, all of these make up a huge continuum and huge diversity of the way in which humans use the future. Foresight is obviously and clearly part of anticipatory thinking. It's clearly part of futures literacy. Futures literacy is the way in which you become aware of the different ways you use the future, one of which is foresight, one of which is strategic planning, one of which is doing laundry lists. So they're all just part of a continuum in one conceptual framework. And therefore, analytically, the distinction that you're drawing it makes no sense to me. But if you say I have to learn the alphabet before I can read Shakespeare, of course you're right. Of course. So somebody needs to say, aha, what is the underlying anticipatory system before they begin to say, well, I'm going to use four quadrants, or I'm going to use Delphi, or I'm going to use morphological analysis. Well, then you say, okay, situate that specific way of thinking about the future, that specific way of using our imagination, situate it in the context of a specific set of anticipatory assumptions. And you say you've read Transforming the Future. You understand that the whole point here is to create a wide range, a big tent that can encompass all of those different anticipatory assumptions that allow us to understand better the anticipatory systems and processes that we actually use, from beginning to most expert.
So correct me if I'm wrong, you include foresight, or at least futures and foresight, inside a bigger umbrella of futures literacy, according to what you just said, right?
Futures literacy is a competency. Explain to me, so let me ask you a question. How would foresight not be an anticipatory system? Foresight's clearly an anticipatory system.
That depends on what we mean by anticipatory system. According to your definition, yes, we can use the word anticipatory system, at least the way I see it, right? It's the way to thinking about the later than now. And I'm quoting you here, right? And so foresight can be seen as a capability, or at least as a set of capability, right? So what I'm trying, why I do this analytical distinction is I'm not trying to split in hairs here. Is as an academic, right? I think we need to be very clear with constructs, and this is perhaps not really the case in practice, because in practice we do confuse all of those terms that we have. We do confuse future studies with foresight with futures literacy. So as an academic, what I'm trying to do is I want to pinpoint where is the difference, where is it overlapping, what is what, so that people are clear, right? So I think we agree on this point. We need to make clarity on all the terms. And I am frustrated when I see that they are used interchangeably, right? So given this being my objective, right, then am I right or am I wrong to say that futures literacy is taught at early stages pedagogical setting? And second question tied to that, when we teach futures, or when we do futures, because as you just said, it's a capability, so it can be taught or can be done, same as a capability, right? Are we actually thinking about a skill that can be an ascending capability, an advanced capability that can increase over time? Or are we thinking about a binary process? Because when I hear about futures literacy, when I hear the word futures literacy, right, what I think is it's either or, either futures literate or not futures literate, right? And it's quite binary in my, at least in my understanding.
Alex, I mean, I think it's, and I appreciate the conflation, because it's a kind of an easy one to do. We associate literacy with grade school, and we say, ah, yes, grade school children learn to read and write, so literacy must be something that, yeah, yeah. And so you know how to read or you don't know how to read. But
Right.
we certainly distinguish between, you know how to read at a high school level, you know how to read at a university level, you know how to read at the level of a technical parsing of meaning in a context, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, I understand that there's a risk of conflating, but certainly, for one thing, at the moment, for the most part, we're not teaching anybody futures literacy at any age, because for the most part, at least my awareness in the world that I deal with, from where I sit these days in UNESCO, and also throughout the last 30 years of my career as a practitioner, working with people to think about the future, it's pretty clear that nobody's thinking about how they think about the future for the most part. Now, there are people who are thinking about how to create scenarios. That is something that's been much more active, okay? And that could be the Hollywood, or it could be the Hudson Institute and Mutually Assured Destruction, or it could be the debates that took place between East and West during the Cold War on the future of capitalism or the future of socialism. I mean, we have had lots of discussion about the way in which we construct societies after the Great Leap Forward or during the Cultural Revolution. In other words, the history of the last 150 years and more than that has exposed us to many, many stories, scenarios of the future, but relatively little work on the underlying anticipatory systems and processes, why we think about the future, how we think about the future. So I think that the perhaps the way to lend greater clarity to all of this is to say, of course, literacy starts where you are. You have to start where you happen to be. If you know the alphabet, well, you start after that. If you don't know the alphabet, well, you have to start with the alphabet. And then as you gradually become more and more skilled, you develop more and more insights. And in fact, as you and I both know, the more you learn, as you get, you realize how little you know. In other words, knowledge is an infinite. And so we're in this context where we're basically building up more and more knowledge, and it's specialized. There's anthropological thinking about how people create their anticipatory systems. There's narrative and mythological thinking about how that, and we can study all of those things. They're all open to study and use. So, I mean, certainly Foresight constitutes one of the important, particularly as it's been vehicled, pushed forward by the importance of planning in the 20th and 21st century, 19th century. But there's also a much greater diversity of ways of thinking about the future. And that's one of the crucial lessons, I think, for instance, of this pandemic, which is the way we think about the future, that we can control it, that we don't like uncertainty, because uncertainty disrupts our plans and makes us feel insecure. This way of thinking about the future is actually dangerous. It actually creates what Taleb calls fragility. So, this issue of non-diversification of the way we think about the future, in other words, a degree of illiteracy, not absolute illiteracy, it's not binary. It's a question of how literate am I? How skilled am I in thinking about different reasons and different methods for imagining the future? So it's a continuum.
Absolutely understood. So when you do teach futures literacy, what is the common audience that you're talking to?
Look, that's a very good question. I mean, the thing is because futures literacy is grounded in something highly universal, In the same way, look, that reading and writing, although maybe less than anticipation, reading and writing are related to language, right? Almost all humans use language, right? Humans use language. Whether we commit our language to a written form is another question. It has empowering aspects, but it also has limiting aspects, etc. Anticipation is something, like I said, that you start where you're at, just like with learning to read and write. And in that sense, the world displays highly diverse anticipatory systems and processes. The narrative structures, the expectations, because these things are deeply related to the human psyche and to our consciousness. Anticipation is arguably one of the fundamental sources of human consciousness. Because we can imagine the future and anticipate, consciousness and the mental models that we require for consciousness and perception are connected to anticipation. So anticipation is a very fundamental attribute of being human. And so we can explore all sorts of different dimensions of that. Learning about it can take many, many forms. Principally today, because we're not very aware of it, we don't think about how we think about the future. The work that we've been doing at UNESCO has been about acquainting people directly with their thinking about the future by getting them to play with it. Learning by doing, action learning, action research. And this can be done with prime ministers or school children, because everybody uses the future. And you can almost always find a way for people to say, aha, that's the way I'm thinking about the future.
I see. Now I think I've reached the understanding that I was looking for. I think that futures literacy, at least as you conceptualize it, is an ascending capability that can increase and can certainly be not just for beginners, but for more advanced. As you say, the comparison that I like a lot is someone who can read and write, but with reading and writing, you can also compose poetry. So it's certainly something that can increase from 0 to infinite possible. But the thing is, since you believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that at this moment in history, the capacity to thinking about the future is not so developed. Your own work has been primarily in accustoming communities that might have not heard about what future studies, foresight is about. That is why you have been teaching futures literacy at early pedagogical stages. That is just because the moment in history we find ourselves now, right, demands it.
That's correct. You start where people are. You don't give them a lesson in advanced physics if they don't have the basic understanding of what physics is about. It's just the kind of the way. And furthermore, I should say, and I want to be perfectly, is that we're just beginning to discover. Personally, the framework that I propose as a starting point in the book Transforming the Future is just meant to begin the process. We're at the beginning, from my perspective, of really being able to understand the anticipatory systems and processes that characterize the way humans use the future. And so this is just a nascent field. But it's a field which, and I appreciate very much your effort in this regard, that needs us to be clear about what we're trying to study and what we're trying to research and what we're trying to learn. And that learning starts where people are at. And just one more point on this is that I've worked all my life with policymakers. I've worked all my life with the world's, foresight community. And one of the key points here is that people are familiar with planning and preparation. They're familiar with the anticipatory systems, without calling it that they use when they want to plan. I want to build a dam. I want to invest in education because that will allow me to industrialize my economy. This is planning. This is a vision of cause and effect, and it's a way of imagining the future. I imagine Industry 4.0, and I have a scenario, and then somebody says to me, backcast it so I can take the steps to get there. This is the way they use the future. In order to get them to be aware, not that it's wrong, of course it's not wrong, it's one way of thinking about the future. In order to get them to be aware, though, that there are other ways of thinking about the future, and that not only are there that they use those other ways all the time. Because if we look at decision making as distinct from perception, from what you see, the choice on the menu, from what you choose on the menu, if we distinguish those two things, we can see very quickly, and this is one of the things the Foresight community understands very well, is that the Foresight study, which has 6 scenarios, stays on the shelf. And the decision that's made is made for many other reasons related to politics, intuition, contextual situations that are completely outside the scenario framework. And that's fine, because it's part of the mix. We don't confuse decision-making and perception. We don't confuse the role of anticipatory systems in perception and the role of anticipatory systems in choice. We, from the point of view of being academic, as you say, analytical, we can distinguish those different aspects of how anticipatory systems are created and how they are used. And this allows us to understand better what we're doing and to understand the world around us more effectively.
Clear. That's interesting. So possibly we might be able to teach futures literacy to advanced foresight practitioners, so to speak, once the demand is there, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I'm glad that we have reached some clarity that I think, at least before, to many who study futures literacy, many individuals who study futures literacy with whom I've talked about, was not so clear before. At least in my understanding now, at least it is clearer. And I would like to ask you some questions regarding creativity. It seems to me that in organizational scholarship, what we call creativity, there is an agreement. We have agreed upon the definition that creativity is to create something novel in the present that can actually be used. So it's not just about creating something, but it's also creating something that is useful. And when I think about futures literacy, right, I see a lot of parallelism. You can even argue that creativity and futures literacy are almost equal, although maybe futures literacy is a creativity about the future, right? You say that futures literacy enables us to think about the future in a fruitful way in the present. And this to me is so close to creativity. So then my question to you is, and I think this will make a lot of clarity, what is the difference between creativity and futures literacy? Is it creativity, sorry, is futures literacy just creativity about the future?
So great issues that you raised here, Alex. But I mean, for me, again, we need to unpack it a little bit more because, I mean, for one thing, creativity, the way that I tend to think about this is that we live in a universe that makes it possible to have what Ilkka Tuomi calls ontological expansion. In other words, something, the ontology, something that didn't exist comes into existence. So this relates to something that I've been talking about for many, many years, what I call banal creativity. Banal creativity is simply something that you didn't know before. It's not unique, it's not genius, it's the capacity to learn. Well, I mean, it starts from not knowing and it becomes knowing. And you learn something, and therefore you have added to your world becomes bigger. We can even say from an information perspective, you're creating information. Of course, humans forget and also learn, so we expand the information and we contract it. But that's a whole other discussion. On the question of futures literacy and creativity, futures literacy is one attempt to come to grips with how humans can relate to complexity. So from my point of view, complexity contains both repetition and difference. So this is a very basic perspective. There are things that repeat, and you have to be able to identify what repeats, and there are things that are different, that could be completely novel, that you never had a word for, that you never knew anything about. So those differences actually have a wide range, as does the categories for repetition. So creativity exists in many, many different forms. The basic idea that I think we agree on, and that you indicated, is that it's something novel. But then novelty takes many forms. Your point about usage, I mean, it depends again on how you want to define it. But I think if I come up with a new concept, a new idea, I'm using it to think about the world. For me, that's useful. It doesn't have to be physical. It doesn't have to be something tangible. It can be something conceptual. So futures literacy as a capability is actually one of the ways in which we can understand how to make sense of creativity and perhaps to be more creative. So there's those, again, I would want to really make that distinction between being able to perceive the creativity around us. Look, let's say, that I think that the future's, the prosperity of tomorrow depends on people having jobs. So everybody has to have a job working for a company. Everybody has to have a contract, in which case I'm going to pay a huge amount of attention to the conditions for creating jobs. And I won't notice there's a lot of value being created, a lot of economic activity that's outside of that framework, outside of those categories. Let's say that all of a sudden the internet shows up, and you never thought about that, and then all of a sudden search engines show up, and then all of a sudden somebody calls search engine Google. You say, wow, that's something new for me to think about. Being able to invent new words, in being able to realize in the liminal, in the marginal, in the emergent, that there are things we don't understand, that we can't even really name or even perceive. To me, that's part of understanding the creativity of our universe. I think futures literacy is helpful because anticipatory systems, which formulate what we imagine, play a huge role in structuring our perception. If I think that the future is just a target, a goal, I'm going to imagine certain kinds of futures using certain kinds of methods, and I will perceive and pay attention to certain things in the present. I think if you don't treat the future as a target, as if it existed, as if you want to colonize it, it actually allows you, and I've seen this happen over and over, it actually allows you, when you give up on the future as a goal, as a target, you start to see things you would not have seen before. In other words, you are able to appreciate the creativity of our universe, the nature of complexity as a state. Not more complex, less complex. The universe is complex. It does create novelty, things that are unknowable in advance by definition. They could never be known, no matter how much data we have, no matter how good our models are. The universe fabricates, emerges, things that are unknowable in advance. If you're futures literate and you understand how to diversify the way you use the future, you're actually better able to appreciate. It's not comprehensive. It's not, exhaustive. It's not infinite, but you're better able to appreciate things that would not have made sense if you're just projecting the past into the future, because you're able to liberate yourself to a certain extent from the projection of the past into the future. And hence you open up your mind to seeing things that you could not have seen on the basis of the past. So there is a relationship between being creative, perceiving creative aspects of the world around us, being able to experiment, to sense and make sense of experiments, many of which don't correspond to what we expected. And therefore, there is a close relationship between being more able to use the future in diverse ways and our ability to appreciate and live, I think, more fully with difference and diversity, which are characteristics of a creative universe.
Seems to me that the major distinction, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm trying to rephrase your thoughts, is that futures literacy enables us to have this sense-making skill, this sense-making capability, this almost like emancipatory ability to open the possibility towards the future. In respect to creativity, that might be much more tool-oriented, or at least, something regarding something you can use in the present, but it's not really about your options as a human being in comparison to the larger environment. Am I right?
Yeah. Yes, but let me point out, you're absolutely right that it's an emancipatory position, but like reading and writing is an emancipatory proposition. Capabilities are emancipatory. This is the whole point of the Senian idea of freedom, is that it's not just a question of being free, it's the capacity to be free that's crucial here. So you're absolutely right that it has an emancipatory characteristic to it. But let me, kind of appreciate what the difficulty that we have, and it's not just you and me, it's everybody, in using language to talk about this. So you think about this comparison. Imagine you're somebody who lives in a world, and you think the world is flat. You think that the Earth is flat and that you can fall off the ends. Okay, and then somebody comes around and says to you, "Don't be, haven't you heard the latest? The world's round, and I can show you why it's round, et cetera, et cetera." In fact, apparently these debates are still going on today. But and you say, "Okay, wow, that means that my fear of falling off the edge of the Earth it doesn't make any sense anymore, because you can't fall off the edge of the Earth. So the monsters in my mind are not the same today as they were yesterday." So when you say how we orient ourselves towards the future, what I hear from my mind is that there is no future. The future does not exist. You can't, or what you can do is you can say, how am I using my imagination? And what role does my imagination play? And why do I use my imagination? This to me is a way of changing our vocabulary, our discourse, our way of understanding our relationship to the future. The future just does not exist. The future is something that will emerge. And the question really isn't, from my perspective, will I be able to determine the future? Will I be so clever that I can make the future happen? For me, the question is much more, what am I doing now that gives shape and substance to what I believe in and what I am? Now, I can believe that it's better to be prudent, so I save money. Or I believe that I should be prudent from the point of view of climate change, so I'm against carbon. So I will act like that today. But I have no idea, actually, and I'm not justifying what I'm doing on the basis of tomorrow. I'm justifying it on the basis of the assumptions that I take responsibility for now. Now, in the future, it may be completely different. I have no idea. My efforts to be, carbon neutral might have negative effects, or might generate something completely different, etc. So it's a much more modest and humble position with respect to the future, but it's in another way taking much greater responsibility for the way we use our imagination now, and as you said, and you're absolutely right, how we make sense of the world around us in its richness.
Thanks, Riel. I think the metaphor of doing away with the fears of falling off the earth because it's not flat anymore, it's quite apt. So I like that a lot. I think we have a much clearer understanding, at least I do have a much clearer understanding of futures literacy now. I'd like to move on to talk a bit about the difference between futures literacy and futures and foresight. And in this aspect, I'd like to ask you a question. I am thinking about foresight as a participatory capability, right? And there has been a stream of scholarship recently proving this, although this was clear to many practitioners. Scholarship has catched up with this, and many articles on the journal Futures have been written, especially articles by Sarpon and McLean, about foresight as a negotiation, a dialogue for the future. Right? When I think about futures literacy, I don't want to take your words out of context, but many times it sounds quite individual, right? The individual aspect is quite emphasized. The futures literacy is about empowering individuals with the capability to understand the role of conscious anticipation. And in your book, Transforming the Future, I really appreciate the attempt you did in modeling the cognition process behind futures literacy. But that is an individual aspect, right? And indeed, the very term futures literacy reminds us of individuals rather than communities. So how do you conciliate this community aspect with the individual, the more individual emphasis of the word futures literacy? Is it perhaps with the futures literacy laboratory or else?
Yeah. Again, Alex, very, very good questions, things that we really do need to unpack, and a lot of work that needs to be done on all these areas. You know, reading and writing are certainly individual capabilities, but they're social competencies. And in some senses, they're, you know, you can't think of something that's more socially structured, socially based, community based. It's based on a language, which is, what's your tribe's language? What's your valley's language? It's a language that's specific to context and place and history, and it evolves communally. Humans are community based. We are interdependent. And I would take much more of a relational approach to thinking about all of these competencies, all of these attributes of the world around us, which to me are relational. So there's a relational ontology, not an objectivist kind of approach to things. So that's the first thing to say about you know, futures literacy as a socially constructed skill capability. The second thing to say about, and this is one of the really interesting things that happened over my career as a practitioner, for futures foresight forecasting practitioner, was to see something related to data, information. So I was asked, this was back in 1988, to run a big process to think about the future of education. This was in Ontario. And one of the things that I noticed is that it's very difficult for people to imagine the future. You know, it's just hard to do. And so I wondered why it was that it was difficult. And, you know, that's kind of where this competence, capability kind of perception started to develop. But one of the things that I really noticed is that the future is actually a really powerful motivator. People care about the future. They care about, you know, later than now. And on that basis, it can be a kind of magnet for moving the tacit to the explicit. So I also, you know, part of my career was in this knowledge management sphere and Nanaka and collective intelligence and creative work. And so one of the things that I started to notice was that we were picking up on aspects of the world that were not statistical, that were not durable or common denominator based. In other words, we were appreciating, finding ways to describe and make sense of aspects of the world that were particular, specific, ephemeral, emergent. So it became really interesting for me to say, well, why are we doing these joint exercises? Why are we asking people to think together about the future? See, I mean, Delphi as a pooling method was very close to statistics in the sense that you wanted to pool the best estimates and then revise the best estimates to get yourself to the, you know, to the strongest probabilistic position you could on the basis of the best information. And it shared a lot of the attributes of what we do in statistics and information gathering based on statistics. In my PhD was in the area of national income accounting, which is a very strongly statistically based approach towards accounting and describing the world based on accounting. So there's this very intricate and interesting relationship between collective intelligence and the specificity of the world, and at the same time the generality and statistical nature of the world. So you will have seen in the book Transforming the Future that I attempt to make a distinction here between these two epistemological, these two ways of knowing, the general and the specific. It turns out that because people, as we've said already, are using the future all the time, that one of the really easy ways to get people to move from tacit to explicit and to realize that they're using the future and to realize that they can become better at using the future is simply to ask them to imagine the future together. And it's by drawing that out that people say, oh, I'm sharing my idea of the future with somebody else and I'm negotiating the meaning. The problem that I've encountered, and this is kind of continuing the discussion about you know, moving things forward, is to say people can do that very easily, but they do it at a relatively unsophisticated level. You can't ask people, to discuss Shakespeare if they've never read Shakespeare. What can I say? I mean, it's kind of thing. If people are not aware that there are different ways of thinking about the future, if they're not aware that they can actually use their imaginations in different ways on the basis of different assumptions, it's very hard for them to be creative in some ways because they're just using somebody else's official past, future, as Sohail says, kind of given future from somebody else's ideas, and they don't have it themselves. So all of this, the used future. So all of this is really about a collective approach, because this is a social context, and it is about figuring out how to understand the world better around us, which has a collective component and has also a personal capability component. And we need to understand how all of that works together, I think, to create a new conception of human agency, and also a new way of thinking about the relationship of humanity to the world around it. Something that's been pointed out is pretty, dysfunctional in the light of COVID.
Absolutely. Thanks for the answer, Riel. Just last question, still regarding the difference between futures literacy and the larger or smaller, depending on how you see it, domain of futures and foresight. In your book, you mentioned that futures literacy is not intended to exclude future studies. You say that it's a capability that allows us to be more precise about future studies, and I have to agree with that. I would even like to expand your point and say that it seems to me futures literacy can help us to model the cognition process behind the thinking about the future. So, to my understanding, certainly there is a difference between futures literacy and futures and foresight. In my previous video, I concluded that we cannot use the word futures literacy to refer to what we call futures and foresight. What is your opinion about this? Is futures literacy, I think you have already in part answered this question, is futures literacy part of futures and foresight? Is futures literacy larger than futures and foresight according to your understanding, or they're simply two separate things?
Alex, these things are historical in their nature, meaning they're messy and they're emergent. Okay, so clearly there was a time when the Delphic Oracle and the number of eagles flying in the sky for Romulus and Remus were dominant. And so you asked the Delphic Oracle, who hallucinated, talked to the interpreter, who then told the story, and then you tried to figure it out. And that was one way of thinking about the future, and it made a lot of sense because you were trying to interpret the gods, and the gods were obviously distant. The post-war period, talking 20th century, was very dominated by D-Day, the moonshot. It was the Manhattan Project, and the notion of command planning. So the Soviet system, adopted by many people in the world during the 20th century, was a planning process where we decided what we were going to produce, and we went about to do it. And we thought that we could construct the future on that foundation. And there was an idea that science, replacing religion, was nevertheless as certain as religion, meaning science was about certainty. Well, look, all those things are hopefully kind of moving into the past, because that way of understanding the world turns out to not correspond to the universe we live in. We live in a non-deterministic world. So, I mean, the importance of foresight, and having been a member for now many years of the Association of Professional Futurists, and having earned my living for most of my life helping people think about the future, and therefore conducting many foresight exercises, means that foresight's very important, and it plays a crucial part in what you might call a technocratic, bureaucratic, command and control society that's intent on colonizing the future and kind of, insists that you should feel safe because I know, because I can make America great again, or I know what the future will be like, so follow me. Now, in that context, Foresight was really a powerful way to say to people, look, diversify your scenarios, be more open, think about different options, understand that that's good practice if you want to be more robust. Because even if you're being probabilistic, there are different assumptions for your probabilistic risk-based approach. But then there was also a lot of work that said risk and uncertainty actually belong to two different worlds. They're not in the same context. And the question of how we relate to uncertainty also needs to be understood. Now, that begins to bring us towards a broader foundation for anticipation. And then once you begin to do that, you begin to see that there's even more. There's not just risk and uncertainty. There's all the different ways that humans deal with risk and uncertainty. So I would just say that futures literacy is a capability that's based on an anticipatory systems approach to understanding the way in which we use the future. And the study of using the future is future studies. So, I mean, that's my position on all this. We'll see how effective it is and whether it resonates and makes sense to people. I have to say that it looks like it's making a lot of sense to a lot of people. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm these days for taking futures literacy as a basic capability that humanity needs to develop. But to develop is the key word. We're not finished. We're just starting.
So can we say that futures literacy is more about capability, whether future studies is studying that capability? Is that what you are saying?
They're related. I mean, how would you say the study of literature is not related to learning to read and write? Sure it is, because you change the way you learn to to teach and the way people learn. So I mean, these are a continuum. There's a continuum here. There are specializations. There are narrower fields related to cognition, for instance, or neuroscience, or related to anthropology, or related to semiotics. All of those things will help us to understand anticipatory systems. They'll help us to do foresight, but they'll help us to also do other things with the future that are not based on a foresight framework for improving the number of scenarios and the nature of the scenarios within the assumptions that foresight generally uses in practice. Now, just one point here is that these things are not clear cut, and I tried to be very careful, as I think you appreciated in the book, to say there's la prospective in French. There's foresight and strategic foresight and foresight, a wide variety of foresight schools in the world today, and they shouldn't be reduced to just one point of view. But there is a very dominant perspective on the future today, which generally speaking, the foresight community, and I consider myself part of that, fit into. And we fit into this technocratic, bureaucratic, organizational, planning approach to the world. Okay, and it's that brilliant planning that's allowed us to create the fragility of the current pandemic. That brilliant planning. It's, I think, insufficiently humble. I think it's inconsistent with understanding our universe as complex, emergent, and novel. And therefore, it sets us up, because of the narrowness of the way in which the future is used when it's put into practice in that context. It narrows it down in ways which are actually inimical, damaging to our ability to appreciate difference, to appreciate the world around us, and to live more effectively in the world that we are a part of. I didn't say better. I didn't say this is going to create a better future, because I have no idea if learning to read and write will create a better future or a worse future, because capabilities can be used in many different ways. And one of the things that I'm trying to insist upon here is that being futures literate allows us to step back from wanting to know if what we're doing is going to make a better future, because it's that imperative. It's that idea that I must know what's going to make a better future that actually narrows down our use of the future and diminishes our capacity to use our imagination to understand the richness of the world around us, and to make the crucial association that the means are the ends, that our current moral being is our legacy to the future. That's all we really can be part of, because we're not part of the future, we're part of now. So, it is a kind of big picture thing, I'll grant you that, and it's not simple, but it's something where I think we can make a lot of progress doing the kind of work that you're doing, and by working together in this kind of discussion.
That's right. I appreciate you emphasizing the fact that this goes into a much broader domain, which arguably is also about the paradigmatic shift in the mindset, the technocratic, bureaucratic mindset you were talking about. But I guess whether that mindset has to be changed from outside or from within, it's another it's another topic for discussion.
We can do another session on that. Be glad to do that.
Absolutely. So why don't you leave us with something I like to ask a lot to people who have more experience than me, and I think you will be able to give me amazing feedback on this. If you had to do research on something in futures literacy, and I'm talking about rigorous academic research that you think we need, because we need to understand some certain aspect of this construct or related construct, what would you go for?
Great question, Alex, and in some sense there's an embarrassment of riches here at the moment, but speaking purely from the perspective of kind of my own preoccupations, but ones which I think are potentially relevant for academic research, and which I think will, and here I'm being predictive in my own way, will bear fruit, will be useful, will be interesting. I think one of the key questions here is, how do we characterize different sets of anticipatory assumptions? In other words, you'll know that in the book Transforming the Future, there's what's called the Futures Literacy Framework, and it uses an ontological epistemological matrix to try and distinguish different domains, different sets of anticipatory assumptions. The anticipatory assumptions are what characterize different sets of anticipatory systems and processes. I'm really keen on conducting research which allows us to identify those different sets of anticipatory assumptions. In other words, how are people imagining the future? Why are people imagining the future? And can we see changes in those anticipatory assumptions that actually change what they imagine and how they use their imagination? Now, I think I have preliminary evidence for that has been produced, as you mentioned before, by futures literacy laboratories, but we're just at the beginning of that. The laboratories, which are living labs, are meant to generate evidence of the differences in the anticipatory assumptions that people use, and to show that if you have different sets, what I call AA1, anticipatory assumptions in the first matrix, and AA6, which is at the far other end, that there's a difference there. And what are the nature of those differences? And I think we have a lot of research we can do on anthropology, semiotics, on symbolism, on decision making, on perception, on subjective conceptions of agency, on expectations, on psychology, that could be really usefully applied to understanding better the different natures of our anticipatory systems and processes. Now, that I think is something that would also help to refine that framework. So I'm not saying that my framework is the end of the story. I just think it's the beginning, hopefully. And I'm sure it will get much better over time. But for me, that's a really profound area of research, because it's precisely what I think future studies should be doing. From my perspective, just constructing scenarios, I don't care how diverse, if it's fiction scenarios or morphological scenarios, just constructing scenarios and just collecting scenarios is, to me, really not the primary focus of future studies. For me, the primary focus of future studies is anticipatory systems and processes. It's the underlying structures and processes that generate why do we imagine, what do we imagine. So it's just like it's more like saying, I'm not interested in so much in the symptoms. Symptoms are important, but the underlying processes.
Well, if we go back to the model of the different phases, right, of anticipatory system, and they are in sequence, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that according to what you say, it would be very interesting to look at whether teaching futures literacy, and the futures literacy laboratory here certainly plays a role, can actually affect the transfer from the more basic system to the more advanced system. I think, assuming that your model of this six anticipatory system, as you lay out in your book, is actually what's going on in our mind, I would find it particularly interesting to do a research on whether when you go and teach it, when you go and teach Futures Literacy Laboratory, that's actually what happened, that we start from the first and we go to the second and up until the sixth, right?
Well, just a crucial thing to say in that regard, and I agree. You know, that's one of the things that we're actually doing in the Futures Literacy Laboratories as we evaluate how it functions and how the framework applies to the laboratory, because that's hypothesis testing. Is just to say, we're continuously walking on two legs or seeing the world with two eyes, meaning we make bets, okay? And bets are risk-based. We have models and we make our bets. And we're speculating, and we're dreaming, and we're imagining, and we're open, and we're disturbed, and we're hallucinating. And in other words, we're in the ephemeral rather than the durable. We're in the particular rather than the general. In other words, we are complex whole creatures. And it's not that you go in one direction and never come back. It's you're always going back and forth. You're always kind of being bounced to different spheres and different contexts. From the point of view of research, the key thing here is to just identify the different categories and to be able to show that people are doing things in different ways in different contexts with different outcomes. And that's a scientific endeavor because it's hypothesis testing with evidence. And that way we're learning more about the world. It's not definitive, it's not finished, it's not certainty, it's just generating in the present a better understanding of the world around us.
Thanks for your time today. Great to talk with you, Riel.
Thanks, Alex. Really appreciate it. And anytime. Okay. Have a good one. Bye-bye.